Thank you all very much for having me here, and I'll start with an apology to be so casually dressed. I have been very eager to get to Arkansas. My luggage has been more reluctant. I spoke with Delta just a little bit ago, and they said my bag is either in Virginia, South Carolina, Atlanta, or Arkansas, so that's progress. But I had a suit that added at least 75 to 80 points to my IQ. I just have to do without. This talk used to be spectacular. But thank you all very much, particularly to Paige, for inviting me down here. Can you imagine having a student like Paige around in class? It's a once in a lifetime situation. And I have to brag on her just for a second. I mean, Paige is as fine a student, scholar, writer, teacher as she is an actress. And you all are very, very lucky to have her here. And I was lucky to work with her in the past. Now, Paige and I have always sort of enjoyed, at least I've enjoyed, I can't speak for her, enjoyed a kind of, I hope, a sort of comic communication style. When she initially emailed me and asked me to come down here, there was some sort of like slight ambiguity in the email that seemed to suggest, even barely, that not only was she appearing in Othello, but she might be appearing as Othello. and so I seized on that sort of like little grammatical wobble, like a sort of magpie snatching a shiny trinket. And I wrote back and said, like, well, obviously, like, yes, I would be just delighted to come. And furthermore, I was looking forward to seeing her play Othello. Right. And you know, I kind of like, I barely gave this kind of like comic exchange any more thought until I went back and when I was preparing this talk, I just like looked at our email exchanges, and I began to sort of think about, well, what is so funny about the idea of Paige playing Othello? And you know, I sort of began to sort of like worry over this a little bit and sort of think about it, and you know, sort of upon analysis, this joke, if it could be called that, kind of derives this comic torque from sort of two places, right? Two ideas. And one, of course, was my sort of like simple-minded misreading of her email. You know, and this is funny, sort of due to the like universal comic notion that simple-mindedness is always funny. This is a comic principle. By contrast, multi-mindedness or sort of consciousness can produce wit, but almost always produces tragedy. And sort of Shakespeare has a very long essay on this called Hamlet. And so like that was sort of like one source of the humor of this joke. And then I began to sort of think about like that joke has a kind of more serious punchline that upon sort of reflection doesn't actually reflect particularly well upon me. And because of course like an element of like what's funny about the idea of Paige playing Othello is the idea of a white woman playing a black man. This is part of the gag. And sort of like to be clear, what's funny is not the idea of a woman playing a man. I mean, this is a phenomenon that has both a current and a sort of long history in Shakespeare performance, right? I mean, if Paige had sort of inadvertently or otherwise sort of communicated to me that she was playing Hamlet or Romeo, right? I mean, I would have probably made some ungallant age joke, right? The last chance player to present Romeo and Juliet. Sort of thing. But sort of like, you know, cross-gender casting doesn't really particularly generate any kind of comic fizz in and of itself. So it wasn't sort of really that. But to sort of like to drill down even sort of like further into this, like probably increasingly unfunny joke. The idea, of course, of a white person playing a black character is not funny, either, particularly today, right? And this is a notion that most people today sort of find sort of ethically repugnant. Or at least let us agree, kind of controversial, right? So it wasn't that. No, like the joke that I was making was built very specifically on the idea of a white woman playing a black man, of the actress playing Desdemona instead playing Othello. And of course, like keeping the bodies of Othello and Desdemona sort of chastely quarantined from one another is, of course, one of the preoccupations of most of the male characters in this play. And so, in short, you know, upon reflection, and as I said, one that doesn't reflect particularly well on me, my sort of offhand joke was sort of predicated upon the precise kind of racial categorization, segregation that figures like Bodancio in the play kind of insist upon, right? His sort of bewildered outrage that his fair daughter will love the dark boy. Now I am, at least putatively, a scholar, and so I live largely in the past, and so like to sort of like, to try to like understand my own sort of not particularly sort of defensible joke. I sort of like did some research on this idea, like sort of a white woman playing, sort of the idea of a black-faced Desdemona in theater history, the idea of a girl named Othello. And as it turns out, my joke is not only not particularly funny, it's not particularly original. Because that sort of like comic idea participates in, as it turns out, a very, very kind of like long history of sort of theatrical anecdotes and stories that kind of process anxieties about racial mixture by obsessing sort of over the technologies of racial representation, in this case, blackface makeup. And obsessing in particular over the idea of like the blackface makeup of the white actor playing Othello getting onto the skin of Desdemona. Lots of stories about this. And so sort of like what I'm sort of going to like work on and sort of worry over and just sort of like for a few moments with you is this kind of peculiar fixation that theater artists and reviewers and scholars have about sort of the Othello actor's makeup and its potential transfer onto the skin of Desdemona. Because like this kind of obsession, of course, becomes a way to kind of defer and channel and process anxieties about racial mixture and miscegenation. If it were still acceptable in the play company to talk about Freud, we could be sort of thinking about transference, right? And the way that these kind of jokes transfer or redirect our attention away from what we're actually concerned about, the sort of the actual racial unease about the skin, and onto its theatrical proxy, which is the black makeup. But I'll stop theorizing unless I break out in French, and I'll start actually just like share in the interest of time just a couple of sort of like the theatrical anecdotes that I'm talking about that sort of provide this kind of history of these sort of jokes. Back in the 1890s, an apparently solid and unspectacular actor named Louis James appeared as Othello, a white man, was playing Othello in New York. And one night, while he was standing over the sleeping Desdemona in Act 5, he deliberately transferred some of his makeup to the actress's face, inscribing a mustache and a small beard on her as she slept. And here I'll quote sort of directly from the anecdote as it was transcribed later in 1920. So, quote, "It was unnoticed by the audience, but later, as other actors came upon the scene and saw the face of Desdemona lying on the pillow, wreathed in golden hair, but disfigured by apparently hirsute tufts over her mouth and chin, they were convulsed with laughter, and the effect of the great tragic scene was destroyed." So that's like, a kind of version of the same joke. But by marking Desdemona with his makeup, the Othello actor here was rendering his Desdemona simultaneously dark and male, when he used his makeup to put a beard on her, not just on her face. Sort of converting Desdemona into a male Moor and cracking up his fellow actors at the same time. Now of course this is just like a comic theatrical anecdote, right? Like, ha-ha, right? And like most theatrical anecdotes, is probably not true, right? But at the same time, like the reason, and when we call something anecdotal evidence to discredit its purchase upon the truth, but anecdotal evidence is evidence of something, right? And sort of what I'm suggesting here is that the evidence that this anxiety or the evidence of this anecdote is about sort of racial anxiety, right? And so you note the verb disfigured in this story, right? Desdemona was wreathed in golden hair, but disfigured, right? And that verb disfigured begins to sort of release some of that particular unease that the idea of a black-faced Desdemona registers across and within theater history, including my own version of that same event that I unwittingly rehearsed on the page in my email. And as I said, this is not an isolated story, this is not an isolated anecdote. And as I said, there's a particular kind of tradition of theatrical anecdotalism that worries over the transfer of the artificial pigment from the face of the white man playing Othello in blackface to the white woman playing Desdemona. And I'm suggesting, of course, that there's a specific reason for the durability of this obsession with the makeup and the consequence of its transfer. And so, like, to give you kind of a working thesis here, these anecdotes, these gags, my sort of sorry joke page, sort of process the theater industry's own anxieties as it worries through the play's own concern with racial pollution and miscegenation.